First of all, I wish to thank Madam McBain for allowing me to share a few thoughts with this distinguished gathering. This week, in fact last week, we saw tremendous turmoil in the financial markets around the world. And I think this makes the discussion here today much more relevant and topical. The problem is that we live in the 21st century, but we are still governed globally by institutions that were created in the 1940s in the aftermath of the Second World War. These institutions, no doubt, have assisted in preservation of peace and development. The world has changed over the past 60 years, and more people are out of poverty. We have created wealth many times over. We have not had another war since the 1940s, at least at a global scale. We've had many different kinds of wars. So we may say that these institutions have served their purpose to an extent, but we'd never know to what extent because we do not have competing institutions, and many of the institutions have not evolved in keeping with the changing times. So today, I just want to focus on a few things that I think that will be important in the future as we try to refashion these enterprises, these agencies, to be relevant to today's reality. I think the first has to do with global financial stability as a global public good. We all recognize that when there is instability in the market, wherever that's created and whatever the source it is, whether it's in the emerging market or now in the developed world, that it affects welfare right across the world. We've seen in the Asian crisis, and now we're likely to see the fallout from this more recent one. Millions of people lost welfare. Countries that were following the Washington consensus almost faithfully saw overnight, because of the movement of large sums of money, a significant loss of welfare in their countries. So that's the first task that I think we need to address at the global level. Secondly, I think the whole issue of the environment, the environmental challenges could lead to catastrophe in the future if not addressed urgently. So I would link environment with energy and food security. We've seen lending to agriculture declined, and we have seen the UNEP, that is the United Nations Environmental Program, which is probably the only major environmental governance agency on a global scale with a budget of $60 million, when the capital markets now have grown, in Europe alone, the European Union trading scheme, to over $60 billion in just two years. So I think we need to evolve a global environmental governance system to address the challenges of climate change, which could become catastrophic if not addressed. And then the third set of issues that I would like to focus on that I think are important in today's world are issues of security and terrorism. When we examine what has happened over the past several years, we see three groups of countries when we talk about reform of global agencies, and each with different agendas. The first group of countries that want to preserve the status quo, and often they're the developed countries of the world, because in the current governance structures, they're well represented and they have a disproportionate voice in these institutions, at the IMF, at the World Bank and in the United Nations at the Security Council. They want to preserve that status quo. Then the second group of countries are the emerging large countries. They feel, rightfully so, that they contribute more to the global economy since the 1940s when these institutions were evolved, so that they should have a greater say in the management of these and in the affairs of these global agencies. So they're arguing for changes in the Security Council to expand its membership. They're arguing at the World Bank level and at the level of the IMF that they should have greater shareholding. And then the third group of countries are the small developing countries that have very little voice, and they are arguing for greater flexibility in these institutions, not necessarily changes in the ownership structure, but greater a series of instruments that will address their concerns as you move forward. So how have we fared? I chaired the Board of Governors meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in Singapore a couple of years ago. And there was an attempt to reform, or there's an ongoing attempt to reform the IMF. They call it the voice and quota reform. And at that meeting, for the first time, small amounts of shares were given to a few large countries. But I feel that these changes are not driven by the need to make these institutions relevant to today's reality, but more because of fear of irrelevance. The sovereign wealth funds have grown tremendously. Regional financial arrangements in Asia threaten to dwarf the portfolios of these institutions, particularly the IMF, and to relegate it into irrelevance. So that discussion has been taking place there, but it's not deep enough. It is not deep enough. It is still tinkering around the edges, and at the end of this process, I feel we now have a better institution than the one that we have today. We've always argued that the IMF should focus in its core on global financial stability as a global public good. And for it to do that, you have to have a change in its mandate, so that it focuses on that. You have to develop new instruments to discharge this mandate. Passive surveillance will not work anymore. After the Asian crisis, they focused more on surveillance and monitoring. But what happened? They developed a whole new range of instruments, but the application of the instruments was uneven. Take, for example, the FSAP, which is a financial sector assessment. We in the small countries had to agree to it. The United States of America did not. I think had the United States of America agreed to that financial sector assessment, the problems that you have seen over the past week could have been avoided to some extent, because the IMF would have looked at the health of the financial system, and no doubt would have pointed out the risk of some of these derivatives and off-balance sheet instruments that have caused so much of the problem. I feel that a new IMF should have a mandate to look at the private sector and to look at the balance sheets of private institutions. Because if you look at global financial stability, then you have to look at the balance sheet and on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet items of the private sector.